The air in the Whitman Financial Strategies boardroom was thick, not just with expensive cologne and the scent of polished mahogany, but with a specific kind of corporate dread. It was the dread that settles in when the head honcho, Charles Whitman himself, decides it's time for a strategy deep dive, which everyone knew was code for, "I'm going to yell at you about the bottom line until you promise to cut costs that I don't personally feel." Before we dive into this corporate disaster, hit that subscribe button if you love stories about karma in the workplace. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Now, back to Charles. Charles Whitman was a man built for the stage, even if the stage was just the 20-foot expanse of tempered glass and chrome that made up his primary conference table. He was a creature of immaculate tailoring and aggressive confidence. Everything about Charles screamed success: the custom-made Italian shoes, the cufflinks that probably cost more than some employee's monthly rent, and that booming, authoritative voice that could fill an auditorium without a microphone. He was standing right next to the massive smart screen, a digital behemoth that took up an entire wall. His presentation, titled "Profit Discipline, the Unyielding Mandate," was already 3 hours in, and the 20 or so executives and managers seated around the table looked like they were running on fumes and lukewarm coffee. "Look, people," Charles boomed, gesturing emphatically at a graph showing a shallow, disappointing upward curve. "We preach financial intelligence. We sell discipline. We are the architects of fiscal prudence for our clients. And yet, I look at the Q2 expense reports, and what do I see? Waste. I see bloated budgets. I see someone expensing a $14 artisanal toast breakfast. $14! Do you understand what $14 represents when leveraged across the entire firm?"
He didn't wait for an answer, which was standard. Charles wasn't looking for dialogue. He was looking for submission. It represents indiscipline. It represents a soft approach to the hard reality of the market. We are here to make profit, not to be comfortable, not to be nice. Profit is the only metric that matters, and if you aren't delivering it, you are a liability, not an asset. He paced the front of the room, his eyes scanning the faces, daring anyone to look away. Most were scribbling furiously, pretending that his generic motivational speaker rhetoric was somehow critical information. In the shadows, tucked neatly behind a portable control panel near the wall, was Helen Brooks. Helen was the definition of invisible efficiency. She was Charles's executive assistant, his secretary, his gatekeeper, and, crucially, the person who made sure the massive smart screen didn't suddenly display the wrong email or, God forbid, a personal text message. She wore a simple charcoal suit, her hair pulled back tightly. Her movements were economical. She never fidgeted, never coughed, and only spoke when spoken to, which was almost never unless Charles needed more water or a slide advanced. For Helen, the entire Whitman financial operation was a masterclass in hypocrisy. She was the one who processed the invoices, booked the first-class flights Charles claimed were necessary for client optics, and battled with vendors over the fees for the imported marble Charles insisted on for the executive restrooms. She was paid barely enough to cover her rent in a decent part of the city, and just last week she had received a formal written warning about a minor clerical error on a travel itinerary, a warning that had felt more like a threat. She watched Charles now, feeling a familiar, cold detachment. He was railing about cost control while wearing a watch that could fund her retirement. Helen's job during these briefings was simple: be ready. She had the master control sheet, a thick binder holding every slide, every data backup, and every possible financial summary Charles might request to prove a point. She was the silent technician powering the illusion. Quick question for you. Have you ever worked for someone like Charles? Someone who preaches one thing but lives another? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. All right, let's meet our third character. In the back corner of the room, seated against the wall, was Daniel Price. Daniel was a junior payroll clerk, only 23, and usually he wouldn't be invited to a strategy briefing this high level, but his boss was out sick, and Charles had demanded full representation from every department, meaning Daniel was drafted to sit silently and absorb the lecture. Daniel, unlike the higher-ups, wasn't taking notes on profit discipline. He was doing mental math. He knew something was profoundly wrong. For the past 6 weeks, the payroll department had been under strict, confidential orders to delay direct deposits for non-essential staff by exactly 48 hours. It was always blamed on system glitches or bank processing errors,
but Daniel was the one who processed the ACH transfers. He knew the system wasn't glitching. The company's operating account was simply running dry at the wrong time of the month. They were float-checking their own employees. He kept his expression neutral, but his stomach churned every time Charles used the word solvency. If you're enjoying this story so far, smash that like button. It really helps the algorithm show this to more people. And stick around, because what happens next is absolutely wild. Charles wrapped up his tirade against artisanal toast and moved to the final section, confidence and capitalization.
Now, I know some of you may be wondering, Charles said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, though it still echoed off the polished surfaces, if these minor inefficiencies reflect a larger structural problem. Let me assure you, they do not. Whitman Financial Strategies is not just profitable. We are well capitalized. We hold deep reserves. We have liquidity that would make our competitors weep. He paused for dramatic effect, placing his hands flat on the table and leaning forward, projecting absolute control. We are solid. We are rock solid. And to prove that we walk the walk, not just talk the talk, I want to show you exactly how healthy we are. Helen? Charles snapped, turning his attention to her for the first time in 3 hours. Pull up the real-time summary. Show these people the current operating account status. Let them see the raw, unvarnished truth of our capitalization. Access the primary account dashboard right now. Helen felt a sudden, cold spike of adrenaline. This was unusual. Charles never showed the actual operating dashboard in internal meetings. He usually relied on the sanitized quarter-end reports prepared by the accounting team. But he had demanded it, and her instruction was to be ready with whatever he asked for. "Yes, Mr. Whitman," she replied quietly. Her voice was flat, professional. She reached for the keyboard hidden beneath the control panel. Her fingers, familiar with the complex layers of corporate security, moved quickly and precisely. She didn't need to look at the binder. She knew the access codes and the pathway by heart. She was opening the direct portal to the company's primary bank, the massive global institution that managed their daily cash flow. Charles, savoring the moment, turned back to the audience. "We hide nothing here. Transparency is key. We are operating from a position of absolute strength." He looked directly at a senior VP named Marcus, who had been looking skeptical earlier. "Marcus, I want you to see this. I want everyone to see this. This is what financial discipline delivers." Helen hit the final key sequence. The projected slide of profit discipline vanished instantly, replaced by the stark, clinical interface of the corporate banking portal. The brightness of the screen seemed to increase tenfold, illuminating the boardroom with a harsh digital light. The logo of the major bank, usually a calming blue, was visible in the corner. Below it, the main dashboard loaded instantly. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just lack sound, but actively sucks the air out of the room. The first thing the 20 people in the boardroom saw was the header, Whitman Financial Strategies, Primary Operating Account. The second thing they saw was the number under Current Available Balance. It was not a large, comfortable black number. It was a number preceded by a minus sign, displayed in a jarring, unmistakable shade of digital red. Current Available Balance, negative $1,478,902.55. $1.4 million, negative. Charles Whitman, who had just been pontificating about the unyielding mandate of profit, was staring at a massive 7-figure shortfall displayed for his entire leadership team. The dashboard didn't stop there. Banks, being banks, are meticulous about their bookkeeping, even when the books are empty. Below the glaring negative balance, there were several smaller bulleted alerts, each underlined in a cautionary yellow that looked almost aggressive against the white background. Overdraft fees assessed past 7 days, $18,500. Pending wire transfers hold, $2,300,000. And then, right near the bottom, in an even deeper, more urgent shade of red than the balance itself, was a small, flashing status box.
Credit line status, frozen, insufficient collateral. The timestamp in the upper right corner was indisputable, 10:47 a.m., October 17th. It was real time. It was current. Can you imagine the absolute silence in that room? If you've ever witnessed a moment like this at work, where everything just falls apart, comment,
I've been there below. Now let's see how Charles reacts. Charles Whitman stopped breathing. He had been standing less than 2 feet from the screen, ready to deliver a triumphant closing statement about their wealth. Now he looked like a statue carved from cheap marble. All the color had drained from his face, leaving him chalk white under the harsh glare of the projector. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume. Helen Brooks, who had triggered the display, did not move. Her hands rested lightly on the control panel. She had executed the instruction perfectly. She had been asked to show the operating account status, and she had shown the operating account status. Her face remained composed, a mask of professional neutrality. Across the room, Daniel Price, the young payroll clerk, felt a sickening sense of validation. The delayed salaries, the system glitches. It wasn't incompetence, it was panic. They weren't just low on cash, they were upside down by nearly $1.5 million, and the bank had cut them off. He understood immediately that this was not a temporary dip, this was a crisis. He kept his eyes glued to the screen, but he dared not make a sound, lest he draw Charles's attention. The silence grew heavier. Marcus, the skeptical VP Charles had singled out moments ago, slowly, almost imperceptibly, set his expensive pen down on his notepad. The scratching sound of the pen hitting the leather was audible in the void. He did not look at Charles. He looked only at the screen, analyzing the numbers as if they were a foreign language he was desperately trying to translate.
Charles finally moved. It was a small, jerky movement. He took 1 step closer to the screen, his shoulder nearly brushing the projection surface. He didn't reach out, and he didn't speak. He just stared at the bright red numbers, as if willing them to change color, to shift from negative to positive simply through the sheer force of his will. But the numbers held fast. Negative, frozen, overdraft. The entire facade of Charles Whitman, the man who lectured the world on profit discipline, the master of his financial universe, had just been obliterated by a single, brutally honest bank dashboard. Helen waited. She knew the protocol. She was not to turn off the display unless instructed. She was merely the messenger, and the message was delivered. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. The meeting was supposed to run another hour, concluding with a celebratory lunch Charles had planned to expense lavishly. Now, the atmosphere was poisonous. Finally, Charles managed a sound, a dry, rasping cough that seemed to catch in his throat. He still didn't look at anyone. The presentation is concluded, Charles managed, the booming authority completely gone from his voice, replaced by a hollow monotone. No one asked questions, no one offered a clarification, no one pretended the numbers were wrong. To challenge the authenticity of a live bank dashboard in front of the man who demanded transparency was unthinkable. The executives began to move, but with a strange, hesitant slowness, as if exiting too quickly would confirm the gravity of the disaster. They gathered their notes, their laptops, and their expensive water bottles, performing a ritual of calculated avoidance. Every single person in that room understood that they had just witnessed a corporate death. They avoided eye contact with Charles, and more importantly, they avoided eye contact with Helen.
Daniel Price stood up slowly, stuffing his notebook into his worn backpack. He walked toward the door, feeling the weight of the secret now shared by 20 people. He knew his delayed paycheck wasn't a mistake. It was a symptom of the $1.4 million hole Charles had been trying to hide. Within 5 minutes, the massive boardroom, usually buzzing with tense chatter, was nearly empty. The heavy door clicked shut behind the last manager. Only 2 people remained. Helen Brooks stood by the control panel, perfectly still. Charles Whitman stood by the screen, still staring at the red numbers that detailed his ruin. Helen waited for the dismissal, or the scream, or the inevitable furious blaming, but no instruction came. Charles simply stood there, a defeated monarch in an empty throne room. After a full minute of silence, the screen's operating system, recognizing the lack of input, shifted to a power-saving mode.
The harsh, red-lit display of the negative balance winked out, replaced by a soft, uniform black. Charles Whitman was left standing alone in the dark reflection of his own failure. Helen, still not dismissed, remained by the panel, waiting for the order that would define her future or his. The silence that fell after the screen went dark wasn't restful. It was heavy, like a lead blanket. Charles Whitman remained in the same spot, facing the wall, but now the reflection of his own face was what stared back to him, a pale, distorted image floating on the black glass. He didn't move for a long time. Helen Brooks watched him. She could hear the faint, distant hum of the building's ventilation system, a sound usually drowned out by Charles's voice, but now it was the loudest thing in the room. Finally, Charles turned. He didn't whip around in a fury, which was his usual style. Instead, the movement was slow, deliberate, like a mechanism grinding back into life after seizing up. His eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, were dull.
He looked at Helen, really looked at her, for the first time in months. Not as a tool or a fixture, but as a person who had just witnessed his professional undoing. "Helen," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper, ragged at the edges. What was that?" Helen didn't flinch. "That was the current operating account status, Mr. Whitman, as you requested." "Don't be deliberately obtuse," Charles snapped, the whisper immediately escalating into a low, vicious hiss. He took a step toward her. "That was the wrong account. That was a glitch. That was manipulated data. You displayed the wrong summary." "Sir, you asked for the primary account dashboard," Helen stated calmly, her eyes meeting his. She maintained the same neutral expression she used when ordering his lunch or booking his flights. "I accessed the primary account dashboard. It was a real-time feed from the bank's portal." He stopped, realizing the flaw in his immediate defense. He had demanded the raw, unvarnished truth to prove his strength. "You knew," Charles accused, his voice thick with disbelief. "You saw those numbers when you logged in. Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you put up a placeholder?" "My instruction," Helen replied, her voice steady, "was to display the real-time summary upon your command, Mr. Whitman. I executed the instruction precisely." She didn't add the obvious. "You never check the numbers before you demand to see them, because you assume they reflect the fantasy you sell." But the thought hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Charles ran a hand over his perfectly slicked hair, dislodging a few strands. The action itself seemed to signal the crumbling of his control. He walked over to the mahogany table, picked up a glass of water, and drained it in one gulp. "They saw it," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Marcus, Jennings, every single department head. They saw the frozen credit line." He shuddered. "They know." "They do, sir," Helen confirmed. Charles spun around, his eyes blazing with a new, dangerous focus. This wasn't panic anymore. It was the cold calculation of a cornered animal. "Listen to me, Helen," he said, his voice dropping again, becoming dangerously soft. "This never happened. That was a staging error, a technical fault. The bank's system was undergoing maintenance and displayed cached, erroneous data. Do you understand?" Helen just waited, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I need you to call accounting right now. Get James on the phone. Tell him to generate a retroactive report dated yesterday morning showing a minimum positive balance of $20 million. I don't care how he does it. We need it by the end of the day."
He was demanding a forgery, a cover-up designed to be shown to the executives who had just witnessed the truth. Before Helen could respond, Charles's personal cell phone began to vibrate on the table, a loud, insistent buzz against the polished wood. The caller ID flashed: Roger Stone, CFO. Charles snatched the phone up, his face tightening instantly. "Roger, you better have a damn good explanation for what just happened in my boardroom." He paced the length of the table, his words clipped and furious, though he kept his voice low so Helen couldn't catch the details. But she didn't need the details. The tone was enough. Charles was no longer lecturing, he was begging, arguing, and finally, despairing. "What do you mean they hit the trigger?" Charles hissed into the phone. "I told you to make the transfer. Use the client escrow funds. Bridge it for 24 hours. I don't care. We need that $2.3 million released." Helen's mind clicked back to the dashboard. Pending wire transfers hold $2,300,000. The bank was refusing to release a major transfer, likely vendor payments or client disbursements, because the operating account was deep in the red. And Charles was apparently trying to borrow from client funds, a massive ethical and likely legal breach, just to cover the shortfall. "No, you idiot! You can't tell them we're illiquid. If the market hears about this, the stock drops to zero by morning. We lose the Hansen account." Charles lowered his voice further, almost gargling the words. "Fix this, Roger. You have until 5 p.m. If that balance isn't positive, you're not just fired, Roger. You're ruined. And I will make sure the SEC hears about every single accounting trick you ever pulled." He slammed the phone down, his chest heaving. The silence returned, but now it was charged with the threat of corporate collapse. Charles turned his attention back to Helen, his gaze cold and calculating. He didn't need to yell at her, he just needed to control her. "Helen," he began, his tone shifting back to the authoritative, paternalistic voice he used when giving bad performance reviews. "You are a professional. You understand discretion. You understand loyalty." He walked slowly toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "You were recently given a formal written warning, correct, regarding a serious lapse in protocol?" Helen nodded once. "Yes, Mr. Whitman, the travel itinerary error." "An error that could have cost the firm significant capital had I not caught it," Charles embellished, exaggerating the minor mistake into a catastrophe. "Now, I need to know that you understand the severity of showing proprietary bank data to 20 executives. Even if you claim you were following instructions, it was an egregious breach of corporate security protocol. A firing offense, Helen, immediately." He paused, letting the threat hang heavy. "However," he continued, leaning slightly closer, "I understand that pressure can lead to mistakes. If you exercise absolute, complete, unyielding silence about what you saw here today and what you heard on that phone call, I can look past this. I can remove that warning from your file. You keep your job. You keep your salary. You keep your quiet life." He was offering her a deal, silence for survival. He needed her to be invisible again, to disappear back into the shadows of the control panel and pretend the last 10 minutes never happened. "You are essential to this firm, Helen, but your silence is more essential right now than your efficiency. Do we have an understanding?" Helen looked at the man who had treated her as a ghost, who had underpaid her for years, who had threatened her job over a misplaced flight time, and who was now begging for her complicity in covering up financial fraud that would destroy the livelihoods of the junior staff like Daniel Price. "I understand the seriousness of the situation, Mr. Whitman," Helen said, choosing her words with precision. "And you understand the necessity of silence," Charles pressed, needing a clear affirmation. Helen met his gaze steadily. "I understand that I followed your direct instruction. I understand that the data displayed was accurate and current, and I understand that the firm is in a state of severe illiquidity." She refused to promise silence. She simply restated the facts. Charles's face flushed again, a blotchy red creeping up his neck. He realized she was not going to give him the easy yes he wanted. But he was out of time and options. He couldn't afford a public fight with her, not when she held the raw access codes and the timeline of events. "Get out," he finally commanded, waving a dismissive hand toward the door.
Go back to your desk. Do not speak to anyone. If I hear one word, one rumor, I will not hesitate to contact the authorities regarding your previous professional misconduct. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Mr. Whitman," Helen said. She collected her control binder, closed the laptop, and neatly placed the keyboard back beneath the panel. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she always displayed. But now, every movement felt like an act of defiance. She walked past Charles, her charcoal suit brushing the air near his Italian tailoring. She didn't look back. She opened the heavy boardroom door and stepped out into the bustling, oblivious corridor of Whitman Financial Strategies. Meanwhile, Daniel Price was trying to look busy. He had walked the long way back to the payroll department, taking the service elevator just to avoid running into any of the executives who had shared the moment of revelation. The payroll office was tucked away on the 12th floor, a drab space with fluorescent lighting that buzzed constantly. Daniel sat at his cubicle, the cheap gray fabric walls offering no comfort. He opened his computer, pretending to review timesheets, but his brain was entirely focused on the image burned into his memory: $1,478,902.55. He was a junior clerk. He was supposed to process numbers, not understand the existential threat those numbers posed to the entire company structure. But he did understand. He knew the payroll cycle was coming up again in 3 days. If Charles was trying to illegally access client escrow funds just to cover a $2.3 million hold, there was no chance they would meet the general employee payroll. His delayed check wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a warning sign that the ship was sinking, and now he had seen the hole in the hull.
Daniel looked around his office. His cubicle mate, Maria, was chatting loudly on the phone about her weekend plans. She was relying on that paycheck, just like everyone else. The entire 12th floor was filled with people whose financial lives were about to be abruptly paused, if not outright ruined, by Charles Whitman's spectacular failure. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. What was his responsibility? He was an employee. He was supposed to be loyal. But loyalty to whom? To the man who was actively defrauding clients and hiding a catastrophic deficit, or to the dozens of people who trusted that their hard-earned money would be there on Friday? He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the contacts. He thought about calling his older brother, a lawyer in Queens, just to ask for advice, but the risk was too high. If word got out that he, of junior clerk, was talking about the company's internal bank balance, he would be the first person Charles Whitman sacrificed. Just as he was putting the phone away, the silence of the office was shattered by a commotion down the hall. Daniel peered around his cubicle wall. The CFO, Roger Stone, the man Charles had just threatened with the SEC, was sprinting past the office entrance, his face pasty white, his tie loosened. He was followed by 2 men in dark suits who Daniel vaguely recognized as high-level legal counsel. They were heading directly toward the elevator bank that led to the executive suites. The panic was real. The damage control was underway. Daniel quietly logged into the payroll system. He didn't process anything. He just looked at the total amount needed for the next run, $875,000. It was less than the $1.4 million hole, but if the bank had frozen the credit line, all outgoing money was blocked.
He minimized the payroll window and opened a blank document. He started typing, quickly, quietly, documenting everything he knew. The 6 weeks of delayed deposits, the forced silence from his supervisor, the time and date of the boardroom meeting, and the exact red numbers on the screen. He knew this document was his only insurance policy. If Charles tried to pin the blame for the illiquidity on mismanagement by the payroll department, Daniel had a record of the truth. He saved the document to a highly encrypted personal thumb drive and tucked it deep inside his backpack. He looked at the clock. 11:30 a.m. The financial world was still turning, but for Whitman Financial Strategies, the clock was ticking down to total collapse. Back on the 25th floor, Helen Brooks returned to her desk outside Charles's massive, intimidating office. The space was pristine, designed to project competence and exclusivity. She sat down, the weight of the secret pressing on her shoulders. She was still Helen Brooks, the invisible assistant, but she carried the power of a grenade pin she had just pulled. She had work to do. Charles had demanded she call James in accounting to fabricate a report. Helen picked up the phone. She didn't call James. Instead, she called the bank. Not the corporate accounts division. She called her personal contact in the bank's treasury management division, a woman named Sarah who specialized in large-scale corporate account security and fraud prevention. Helen had worked with Sarah for years, troubleshooting minor transfer issues. "Sarah, it's Helen Brooks from Whitman Financial," she said, keeping her voice low and professional. "Oh, hi, Helen. Everything okay? You sound rushed." "No, Sarah, everything is not okay. I need to report an extreme, high-level discrepancy regarding our primary operating account. I need you to confirm that the balance is indeed negative $1.4 million and that the credit line is frozen."
Sarah paused on the other end. "Helen, I can't confirm specific account details." "Sarah, listen to me," Helen cut in, urgency in her tone. "I have direct access. I saw the live dashboard less than an hour ago. My concern is that the principal, Mr. Whitman, is currently attempting to force unauthorized transfers using client escrow funds to cover the shortfall. I am documenting this call and this report. This is a formal internal report of attempted misappropriation of client funds." The word misappropriation had the desired effect. Sarah's voice snapped into formal, serious mode. "Understood, Helen. I will immediately escalate this to our corporate compliance and risk assessment team. We will initiate a full, immediate internal review of all linked accounts, including any client-segregated funds." "Thank you, Sarah," Helen said. "I believe time is critical." She hung up the phone. She hadn't betrayed Charles to the press or to the executives. She had simply done her job, protecting the firm from illegal activity. This is the moment everything changes. If you want more stories about people standing up to corrupt bosses, subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't regret it. Now, here's where it gets even better. By reporting the attempted fraud to the bank's compliance team, she had ensured that the bank would lock down those accounts before Charles or Roger Stone could move the funds. She had effectively tied Charles Whitman's hands. Helen leaned back in her chair. The air in the executive suite felt heavy with impending disaster. A moment later, Charles's office door burst open. He was back, looking wild-eyed. He must have just finished a devastating conversation with Roger Stone, or perhaps even the bank itself. "Helen, did you call James?" Charles demanded, standing in the doorway. "I am in the process of dealing with the financial reports, Mr. Whitman," she replied smoothly. "Never mind that now. The bank, they're asking questions about the escrow accounts. They're auditing the transfer requests. Did you—" Charles stopped, his eyes narrowed. "Did you speak to anyone outside this office about the accounts?" Helen looked up at him, her expression perfectly calm. "I spoke to the appropriate compliance contacts, Mr. Whitman. As per standard corporate security protocol, anytime there is a 7-figure negative balance and a frozen credit line, the bank's risk assessment team is automatically notified to prevent potential fraud or illegal transfers." It was a lie, but it was a perfect, professional lie. She was claiming the bank's own protocol triggered the alarm, not her. Charles stared at her, his jaw working. He couldn't scream at her for following standard protocol. He couldn't fire her for protecting the company from fraud, even if he was the source of the fraud. "You are dismissed for the day, Helen," Charles finally spat out, his voice shaking with suppressed fury. "Go home, do not answer your phone, do not speak to anyone. If this firm survives the next 24 hours, we will discuss your future." "Understood, Mr. Whitman," Helen said. She stood up, grabbed her handbag, and walked toward the elevator. She felt the full force of Charles' defeated, furious gaze boring into her back the entire way. When she stepped into the elevator, she realized the enormity of what she had done. She had not only revealed the truth, but she had also ensured that Charles Whitman could not hide it. She had secured the downfall of the man who called himself the master of profit discipline. As the elevator doors closed, she pulled out her personal phone and texted Daniel Price, the young payroll clerk whose face she barely remembered, but whose silent validation she had noticed in the boardroom. The text was simple. "Paycheck security is compromised. Suggest you check your personal funds immediately. H."
It was a warning, a small act of solidarity with the employees Charles was prepared to sacrifice. What would you do in Helen's position? Would you stay silent to keep your job, or risk everything to do the right thing? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. Helen knew she had just bought Daniel and everyone else a little bit of time. She was leaving the building, but the collapse she initiated was just beginning. The storm was coming, and she had just ensured the doors were locked from the inside. Charles Whitman stood in the middle of his opulent office, his expensive suit now feeling like a cage.
The silence Helen Brooks left behind was worse than any scream. He felt the cold realization settle in. She hadn't just followed instructions, she had set a trap. She had used his demand for transparency as a weapon, and then she had used corporate protocol, the very rules he preached but never followed, to lock him down. The phone on his desk rang again, this time with a number he didn't recognize. He grabbed it, snapping, "Whitman." "Mr. Whitman, this is Agent Miller, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation," a flat, professional voice responded. "We are currently on the 25th floor and require immediate access to all corporate accounts, ledgers, and communication records regarding the recent transfer requests involving segregated client escrow funds." Charles felt the blood drain from his face again. The FDIC. They didn't just show up for an overdraft. They showed up when the bank reported potential criminal activity. Helen's phone call to compliance had worked faster and more effectively than any internal audit ever could. "You have no authority here," Charles roared, regaining a fraction of his bluster. "We have a temporary restraining order freezing all Whitman financial assets, Mr. Whitman," Agent Miller stated calmly. "We were alerted to potential wire fraud and misappropriation of funds. We advise you to cooperate fully." The phone slid from Charles's sweaty hand, clattering against the heavy mahogany desk. It was over. The structure he had built on smoke and mirrors, on aggressive confidence and borrowed money, had just been declared condemned. The $1.4 million hole was no longer just an embarrassment. It was a crime scene. He looked out the panoramic window at the Manhattan skyline, a view that usually made him feel like a god. Now he just felt small, exposed, and utterly ruined. He was still the man in the custom suit, but the emperor had been stripped bare, not by an enemy, but by the quiet woman he had treated like a piece of furniture. Meanwhile, 2 blocks away, Helen Brooks was walking toward the subway entrance, feeling the strange, exhilarating lightness of a person who has just quit a suffocating job and simultaneously averted a major financial disaster. She checked her phone. She saw a reply from Daniel Price. "DP, got it. Thank you. Stay safe." That was enough. Daniel was smart. He would understand that paycheck security is compromised meant immediate withdrawal of every cent available before the bank, now under federal investigation, locked down the payroll accounts too. Helen descended into the familiar, noisy rush of the New York subway system. As she waited for the downtown train, she realized she had no job, no immediate income, and a very powerful, very angry former boss who was probably already plotting how to blame her. But she also knew that the truth was documented, secured, and now in the hands of the federal government. She got on the train, found a seat, and watched the blur of the tunnel walls. She hadn't sought revenge. She had simply demanded accuracy. She had been asked to show the truth, and she had done exactly that. Back on the 12th floor, Daniel Price saw Helen's text and his stomach clenched. He didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what he had to do. He stood up, walked to Maria's cubicle, and leaned in conspiratorially. "Hey, Maria, listen to me," he whispered, his eyes serious. "There's a major, and I mean major, system glitch happening right now. It's affecting the entire network, especially bank transfers. I just got a heads up from IT." Maria frowned. "Another one? Payroll is due Friday, Daniel." "Exactly," he stressed. "Look, I'm being serious. Tell everyone you trust in the non-executive departments. If you have automatic payments coming out, or if you need cash this week, you need to move your money now. Get your available funds out of your main account, like right now. Use an ATM, transfer it to a separate savings account, whatever. It's temporary, but trust me, you do not want to be caught in this glitch." Maria's eyes widened, recognizing the urgency in his tone, even if she didn't understand the cause. "You think our checks won't clear?" "I think it's better to be safe than sorry," Daniel said, giving her a pointed look that conveyed more than his words. "Tell people to check their personal funds immediately." He didn't mention the negative balance or Charles Whitman's fraud. He just used the company's own established lie, the system glitch, to spread the necessary warning. He returned to his desk, took the encrypted thumb drive out of his backpack, and slipped it into his pocket. He then logged out of his computer permanently. He walked past Maria, who was already on her phone, whispering frantically to colleagues. Daniel headed straight for the front door.
He wasn't waiting around for the FDIC or the SEC to ask him questions. He had done his duty to his coworkers, and now he was getting out before the floodgates opened. The floodgates opened the next morning. The news broke with brutal speed. Whitman Financial Strategies offices raided by federal authorities. The headlines were sensational, featuring photos of men in dark suits carrying boxes of documents out of the chrome and glass tower.
The initial reports focused on the severe illiquidity and the attempted use of client escrow funds to cover operational deficits. Charles Whitman, the self-proclaimed guru of profit discipline, was immediately and publicly identified as the central figure in the investigation. The stock, which had already been shaky, plummeted instantly. By noon, trading was halted. If this story taught you something about corporate fraud or workplace ethics, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Knowledge is power, and this kind of stuff happens more often than you think. Whitman Financial Strategies, the empire built on Charles's booming voice and expensive tailoring, was worth less than the artisanal toast Charles had once railed against. The internal chaos was absolute. The employees who had heeded Daniel Price's warning were safe, at least for the moment, because they had secured their personal funds before the federal freeze locked down every corporate account, including payroll. Those who hadn't were left with frozen accounts, unable to pay rent or buy groceries. Daniel Price, safely at home, watched the news coverage. He was fielding nervous calls from Maria and others, who now understood the real meaning of his system glitch warning. They didn't know how he knew, but they knew he had saved them from immediate financial ruin. Weeks passed. The investigation deepened. Charles Whitman was not just disgraced, he was facing serious charges related to fraud, wire transfers, and the illegal use of client funds. The man who had demanded perfection from everyone else was now known nationally as a spectacular, hypocritical failure. His custom-made Italian shoes were visible in the background of grainy news photos as he was escorted into a federal building. Helen Brooks, meanwhile, was interviewed twice by federal agents. She provided them with a calm, chronological account, the boardroom demands, the live dashboard, the exact figures, and Charles's subsequent attempts to demand a fraudulent report and coerce her silence. Her testimony, backed by the bank's own internal compliance reports, triggered by her call, was crucial. She was treated not as a suspect, but as a key witness, a professional who had followed protocol even when it meant exposing the truth. One crisp November afternoon, Helen received an unexpected email. It was from a small, highly respected financial ethics firm based in Boston, the kind of firm that Charles Whitman had always dismissed as too soft and unprofitable. The email was from the managing partner, expressing admiration for her integrity and meticulous record-keeping during the collapse of Whitman Financial. They were looking for an executive administrator who understood the critical importance of financial truth. Helen smiled slightly as she read the offer. The salary was substantially higher than what Charles had ever paid her. The job description emphasized discretion, competence, and a commitment to ethical practice. She accepted immediately. A few days later, while packing up the minimal belongings from her small apartment, she received a final communication. It was a handwritten letter, mailed to her old office and forwarded to her home address. It wasn't from Charles. It was from Daniel Price. He wrote, "Helen, I don't know if you remember me. I was the payroll clerk in the back corner. I saw everything, and I got your text. Because of you, I managed to get the word out just in time. You saved a lot of people from ruin. You didn't just expose him, you protected us. I'm out of there now too. I'm going back to school to finish my degree in accounting, but this time with a focus on forensic analysis. I learned more in that one meeting than in 2 years of college."
Thank you for the raw, unvarnished truth. Helen folded the letter neatly and placed it in her new professional portfolio. She had been the invisible secretary, the person Charles Whitman believed he could manipulate, threaten, and discard. She was the one who was supposed to be silent, subservient, and forgettable. But the one thing Charles had never accounted for was that the person who managed the projector, who knew the access codes, and who was forced to stand in the shadow of his arrogance, was also the only person in the room who truly understood the meaning of the numbers and the value of telling the truth.
Helen Brooks closed the door on her old life, ready to step into a new one, where her competence was finally visible and her integrity was finally profitable. The man who lectured the world about discipline had learned the hard way that the true discipline was not in making a profit, but in telling the truth, no matter the cost. And the cost, for Charles Whitman, had been everything. If you loved this story, check out the video I'm putting in the screen right now about another corporate scandal. And hey, if you're new here, subscribe. I post stories like this every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.